Good afternoon. My name is Josh. I'm with Porter Square Books, coming to you live from my fiction section. With the new shelter in place ruling that came out from the governor of Massachusetts yesterday, the storefront is now closed. But we are still going to be bringing you as much fun bookish content as we can. So look for more videos for booksellers in their fiction sections, in their homes. Look for them telling stories about their reading lives and whatever else we can think of, so everyone feels a little less isolated during these times. Last week, when we were starting to look at this quarantine or shelter in place, author and friend of the store, Max Gladstone, tweeted that he would be interested in trying to read Marcel Proust's masterpiece, 7-volume, In Search of Lost Time. And so I figured to give him a helping hand and also to maybe inspire a few other people to give this brilliant work a try. I talk a little bit, do a short little video today about how the very beginning of the book gives you the kind of keys to read the entire thing. So today I'll be talking about the first paragraph in the first volume, and I'll be reading from this edition because it's the one the store had. A quick little note. This is, of course, a work in translation, and there have been a number of different translations over the years. If you're thinking to yourself, hey, Josh, which translation should I read? I would recommend you read the one you have. When I read it the first time, I read it on these beautiful old books that are my grandmother's. I actually had to cut the pages as I moved on, so that was very cool. But it's an older translation. It's a bit fusty. It's a bit snooty, which causes some problems, potential problems for the reading of the book. But honestly, unless you are a literal Proust scholar, and if you are, I apologize for all the mistakes I'm probably going to make and for how I'm going to probably pronounce the title wrong. But if you're not an actual Proust scholar, it doesn't really matter which translation you start with. So I would read, if you've got one, whatever that one is. If you don't have a copy and are looking to buy one and want a little guidance, the one thing I would say is the French title. And if we were in the store and Kate were there, I would have Kate say this in actual French-sounding French. But the French title for the full 7-volume is La Recherche du Temps Perdu, which translates pretty directly into In Search of Lost Time. But for a long time, translators called it Remembrance of Things Past. I would recommend getting one that's called In Search of Lost Time for 2 reasons. One, none of these words are really in La Recherche du Temps Perdu. And so it doesn't really make a ton of sense to call it this. But second, the final volume in the 7-volume series is called Time Regained. And you can't really regain time you haven't lost. So in that sense, the translations that call it In Search of Lost Time are probably a better translation of the work. But again, whatever you've got, go ahead and read it. I won't tell. So I'll be reading from Swan's Way, which is the first volume of the series of the book. And there are a couple of interesting things about Swan's Way. The first thing is that Swan's Way is shockingly about Swan, Monsieur Swan. But the rest of the book is about Marcel. Marcel, who is the narrator, whose name I think you only see once in the whole series, but someone else could correct me. Monsieur Swan is a family friend of his. And so it's an odd introduction, and that introductions usually introduce you to the hero. But in this case, Proust introduces you to someone who is connected to the hero, but isn't the hero at all. It's fascinating. The other interesting thing about Swan's Way is that it is essentially an introduction for the whole book. So if you're only going to read one, Swan's Way is it. Everything that happens later on in the book, all the themes, all the ideas, some of the characters, a lot of what is most important about the book is in here. In some ways, Proust planted seeds for the entire book in the first volume, Swann's Way. So you get a really good sense of the book, and you can get away with only reading Swann's Way if you want. But I would really encourage you to read the whole series. Just like how if you've got some, I don't know, hydrangea seeds or whatever your favorite flower is, you can plant them, and then you know what it's going to look like in the end. You know what hydrangeas look like. But that still doesn't replace tending them, watching them grow, and eventually watching them bloom. So just reading Swann's Way is like just knowing you've planted hydrangeas. It's pretty good, and it's worth it, but it's not quite the same experience. Okay, so we're going to drill down even a little further. I'm going to read the first paragraph and then talk about how that gives you the keys to read the whole thing. Here we go. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Sometimes, when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say to myself, I'm falling asleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would make as if to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands and to blow out the light. I had gone on thinking, while I was asleep, about what I had just been reading, but these thoughts had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was the immediate subject of my book. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I woke. It did not offend my reason, but lay like scales upon my eyes, and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a former existence must be to a reincarnated spirit. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to apply myself to it or not. And at the same time, my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for my eyes, but even more, perhaps, for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, something dark indeed. So that's how this modernist masterpiece in 7 volumes begins. And there's a lot in here that will help you read the rest of it. You may have heard that Proust writes very long sentences, and that is true. You can encounter, especially later on in later volumes, 4, 5, even more page-long sentences. Now, these are different than, say, the one-sentence books that I love so much, like Duck's Newburyport or The Other Name by John Foss. It's also different from some of the other long-sentence writers, like, say, fellow French author Céline, who used ellipses to kind of string along ideas into semi-sentence-like things. In those cases, the sentences are long because they are describing and interacting with ideas that really struggle against the limitations of grammar. So they're long sentences because sentences, as kind of units of communication, aren't really designed to express those particular ideas. But Proust's long sentences are very different. In fact, they're quite the opposite. His long sentences are long because the ideas and images he is describing, in order to be grammatically correct, must be described in these long sentences. So rather than struggling against grammar as other stylistically challenging books sometimes do, Proust puts it all in correct grammar and kind of reveals something through that. And so every 4-page long sentence you meet is grammatically correct, and because of the idea and image, because the idea and image he is describing is so rich, so complex, so nuanced, the sentence has to be that long. They are sentences you can, if you wanted to, actually diagram. And so what's interesting is, as you can see, there are a couple of long sentences, but not too long. This is Proust asks a type of reading that we're not really used to. And it would be one thing if you were doing the kind of Lucy Ellmann style to just barge right in. But Proust is kind of using some existing reading structures in your mind, and so he kind of gives you a warm-up. So the first paragraph is relatively short, especially for Proust, in terms of Proust's work, and the long sentences are relatively long. The subjects and objects are relatively close. The different clauses are ordered in relatively easily rememberable ways, and so it's kind of like training wheels sentences for what you will encounter later on. Think of it as as the first scene in one of those montage training videos. You know, this is you starting to punch the side of beef in the freezer of literature, I guess. Yeah, we'll go with that. The other really interesting thing about Proust's style is that these long sentences, are often long fuses for small bombs. And what I mean by that is you will often see a long sentence that is ended by a relatively short sentence or even a relatively short paragraph. And from that kind of spark of that short moment, everything else in that sentence is lit up. And suddenly everything else in that sentence is significant. And it just has a very, I use the term bomb because that's what it feels like. It feels like something explodes, something illuminates, something sparkles suddenly in your mind once you've reached this small, shorter sentence or paragraph. So Proust essentially lights a fuse. And you kind of follow that fuse sparking along for 4 or 5 or more pages until you hit something when it explodes. Now, what's interesting about this is, in this case, in the first paragraph, Proust put the bomb first, and it has the fuse follow it afterwards. So the first sentence is relatively short. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. And then we get the fuse. So this is again part of how Proust is training you to read his work. He's saying to you, listen, I know how to write short sentences. I am able to give you a single idea sentence that you can grab in just a second of reading. And I want you to know that you can expect those later on. In fact, I love them so much, I made one of those sentences my first sentence. The other big part of Proust's style is you'll read something and then you'll only find out how significant it is later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes things that you hear about in book 1 or book 2, you only really understand the significance of in book 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And it is it's again like that bomb going off after the long fuse. It's an explosive, illuminating experience when you're reading it. So for a long time, I used to go to bed early. What does that even mean? How is that significant? Why do I care why this narrator, who I don't even know yet, used to go to bed early for a long time? As the overture continues, we actually discover that this time while he is in bed waiting to fall asleep is a formative experience for our hero, Marcel. Because it is in this time that he develops his relationship with the tension between anticipation and anxiety. As the overture goes on, Marley Jameson, we're talking about Proust. Yay! Me learning how to interact with Instagram Live. We'll see how that goes. What we learn as the overture goes on, before the story in Swan's Way begins, is that Marcel was very nervous about the goodnight kiss he would get from his mother every night. And so part of the reason why he would go to bed early is so he could bring that moment a little closer to him in the day. But of course, once he's gotten that goodnight kiss, it's gone until the next day. And he has all this time ahead of him. And so he would essentially lie there thinking about and wondering about when his mother is going to come up and kiss him goodnight. Will it be the best time? Will it be too early? Will it be too late? Is there a party? Might she not come up at all? And so he begins to develop this intense relationship with the tension between anticipation and anxiety. And that's why we care why this character would go to bed early. Now, eventually, as we'll see as the book goes on, this gets even more and more significant. We discover that Marcel ends up understanding this tension as a basic mechanism of love. A tension that also creates a power dynamic between the one who is anticipated and the one who is anxious. Now, in any relationship, any healthy relationship, each person in it should be both. Sometimes you should be the anticipated. Sometimes you should be the one who is anxious. But regardless of that, there's always a power dynamic. The one who is anticipated has a certain amount of power over the one who is anxious. And as we know from the great modern masterpiece Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Hold that thought for just a second. I do have notes. This is how seriously I took this. I do have notes. So I don't skip anything, like I was just about to do. This power dynamic can be manipulated for ill, just like any other power dynamic. It can be manipulated for good, again, just like any power dynamic. And, again, just like any power dynamic, it can be manipulated for sexy fun times. Sometimes all three. Sometimes it shifts around depending on who is doing what, when, where, and why. But it is always something of a power dynamic. And, as I said, with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you, Uncle Ben. The thing about responsibility, though, is, and again, this all comes out more and more as the book goes on, responsibility can be validating. You can feel good about being responsible for something. You can see that as someone telling you they trust you, they value you. But it can also be a burden. You can also feel bound to it in a way that isn't rewarding. And a lot of times, these responsibilities are both. Sometimes it feels great to be responsible for something. Sometimes it is a burden. Sometimes you would rather be free of that. And as the book goes along, Marcel's understanding of that power and that responsibility goes through a number of very significant changes and very significant meanings in their own right. And all of that is in the first book in the 7-volume series, Swann's Way. And really all of that is in the introduction to Swann's Way, which is called the Overture. And really all of that is in the first paragraph of the Overture. And it really all then boils back down into that first very short sentence: for a long time, I used to go to bed early. So, to recap, for those of you who just joined us, and for those of you who will be watching this on YouTube if I don't mess it up again, if you feel like giving Proust a try while you are sheltering in place, any translation that you have, if you have one at hand, go for it. You'll get a lot out of it. If you are buying it or getting it from somewhere, go with one that says "In Search of Lost Time" rather than "Remembrance of Things Past." So if you can only get a "Remembrance of Things Past," that's great. Swann's Way is an introduction for the whole book. The Overture is an introduction for Swann's Way. And the first paragraph will give you the keys both to understanding the themes and some of the mechanics of reading it and experiencing it as you go along. It is beautiful. It is challenging. It was one of those change your life books, and I really hope a lot of you read it. If you'd like to hear a Porter Square Books Libromancer talk about another maybe challenging book, shoot us a message. If any one of us has read it, I'm sure we'll be happy to give it a try. I've put a link in the bio of kind of all the different Prousts you can order. We are fulfilling online orders. It depends a little bit on where it is. Some of them will be able to fulfill directly from the warehouse. Some of them might take a little bit longer. But we really appreciate you spending the time with us. We really hope that these videos that we're going to be doing over the course of the next 2 weeks, or hopefully more, or hopefully less, hopefully no more than that. Will help you feel a little bit more connected both to us and to the world of books and to the community at large. And thank you so much. And we will see you all soon.